On a dusty road at sunset, she found a limping traveler, wounded, weary, and far from home. Without hesitation, she offered him water, bandaged his leg, and gave him a place to rest. To her, he was just a stranger in need. But weeks later, carriages thundered toward her cottage, and that same traveler stepped out, no longer limping, but dressed in wealth and gratitude. In his hands, a title deed and a ring. He hadn't just come to thank her, he'd come to change her life forever. The storm came down like judgment. It clawed at the prairie, tearing through the tall grass and bending the cottonwoods until their branches screamed. Rain fell in sheets so thick the horizon disappeared, swallowed whole by the fury of the sky. Lightning cracked the darkness open, again and again, turning the world white for a breath before plunging it back into shadow. Thunder rolled across the valley like wagon wheels over stone. Inside the old homestead, Clara Wren stood motionless at the window, one hand pressed flat against the warped wooden frame. The glass rattled with every gust. Beyond it, she could see nothing but water and wind, and the occasional flash that lit the yard in jagged silver. The chickens had stopped their noise hours ago. The barn doors were bolted. The fire behind her crackled low, throwing weak orange light across the room. She'd lived through storms before. This land demanded it. But something about tonight felt different. The silence between the thunder felt too long. The shadows felt too still. And then, between one breath and the next, she saw it, a shape, moving. Clara's hand tightened on the curtain. Her breath fogged the glass. The shape stumbled forward through the downpour, bent low against the wind, limping hard on one leg. A man, or what was left of one. His coat hung heavy with rain, his hat long gone. One arm clutched his side, the other dragged uselessly at his thigh. He collapsed 10 feet from her door. Clara stood frozen. Her lantern sat on the table behind her, already lit. The fire hissed as a log split and fell into embers. Outside, the man didn't move. Rain hammered his back, pooling around him in the mud. His face was turned away, hidden beneath the brim of his coat collar. She didn't know him. She didn't know what he'd done, but she knew what the storm would do if she left him there. Clara reached for her shawl, pulled it tight around her shoulders and grabbed the lantern. Her hand trembled as she lifted the latch. The door swung inward with a groan, and the wind hit her like a fist. Rain lashed her face. The lantern flickered but held. She stepped into the storm. The mud sucked at her boots as she crossed the yard. Thunder cracked overhead so close she felt it in her chest. The man still hadn't moved. She crouched beside him, setting the lantern down in the dirt, and touched his shoulder. "Hey, nothing. Can you hear me?" His coat was soaked through. Beneath it, his shirt clung to his ribs, dark with something that wasn't just rain. Blood. She could see it now, seeping through the fabric near his leg, black in the dim light. Clara hooked her hands under his arms and pulled. He was heavier than she expected. Dead weight. She dragged him backward through the mud, inch by inch, her boots slipping, her breath coming hard. The rain pounded her back, the wind tore at her shawl. But she didn't stop. She pulled him across the threshold into the house and let the door slam shut behind them. The fire hissed louder as water dripped from both of them onto the floorboards. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, chest heaving. For a moment she just stared at him, this stranger she dragged out of the storm. His face was pale, smeared with mud and rain. His jaw was clenched even in unconsciousness. A scruff of dark beard covered his chin. His hair was matted to his forehead. And his leg, God, his leg. The right side of his trousers was torn open from knee to boot, the fabric stiff with dried and fresh blood. Beneath it she could see the wound, a deep gash running along his thigh, still weeping red. She swallowed hard. Then she moved. Clara stripped off her shawl and tossed it aside. She grabbed the kettle from the hearth, poured water into a bowl, and tore a clean cloth from the drawer. Her hands worked fast, practiced. She'd done this before, not often, but enough. Her late husband had come home bleeding once, years ago, after a bad fall from a horse. She'd stitched him up by lamplight, her hand steady even as her heart raced. She could do this. She had to. Clara knelt beside the man again and began cleaning the wound. The cloth came away dark. She rinsed it, pressed it back, rinsed it again. The blood kept coming, but slower now. The gash wasn't as deep as she'd feared. No bone showing. No torn muscle. Just a long, angry cut that had bled too much and been left too long. She threaded a needle. Her hands didn't shake. The first stitch went in clean. The man didn't flinch. She pulled it tight, tied it off, and moved to the next. One after another, she closed the wound, her fingers moving by feel as much as sight. The fire crackled behind her. The rain pounded the roof. The storm raged on. When the last stitch was tied, she sat back on her heels and exhaled. The man still hadn't woken. Clara wrapped his leg in clean cloth, tied it off, and draped a blanket over him. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and looked down at him. He was breathing. Shallow but steady. That was enough. She turned away, added another log to the fire, and sat down in the chair by the hearth. Her clothes were still damp. Her hands were still shaking, just a little. She stared into the flames and listened to the storm outside. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he'd done, but she knew she'd done the right thing, even if she didn't know why. The night stretched long. Clara didn't sleep. She sat in the chair, wrapped in a dry blanket, watching the man on her floor. Every so often, his chest would rise a little higher, his breath catching, and she'd lean forward, waiting to see if he'd wake. But he never did. He just lay there, pale and still, like a man caught between one world and the next. The storm began to ease just before dawn. The rain softened to a drizzle. The thunder moved farther away, rumbling low over the distant hills. The wind died down to a whisper. And through the gap in the curtains, Clara saw the first pale edge of light bleeding into the sky. She stood, stretched the stiffness from her back, and walked to the window. The yard was a mess, mud and broken branches everywhere. The gate hung crooked on its hinges. But the storm was gone. The world was quiet again. Behind her, the man stirred. Clara turned. His eyes were open. They were gray, pale and sharp like winter sky. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just looked at her, his gaze steady despite the exhaustion written across his face. Clara stayed where she was. "You're in my house," she said quietly. He blinked, swallowed. His voice came out rough, barely more than a rasp. "I know." Silence. "You were bleeding," Clara said. "In the rain. I brought you inside." He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the ceiling, then back to her. "Thank you." The words were simple. No explanation, no apology. Just, "Thank you." Clara nodded once. "Can you sit up?" He tried. His jaw clenched, and he pushed himself up on one elbow, then the other. His leg stayed straight, the bandage already spotted with fresh blood. He made it halfway before his strength gave out and he slumped back down, breathing hard. "Don't," Clara said. "You'll tear the stitches." He closed his eyes. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough, but you'll live." Another silence. The fire crackled softly. "Where am I?" he asked. 10 miles south of Bitter Creek." "My land." He nodded slowly, as if filing that away. Then he looked at her again, his expression unreadable. "You live alone?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." He didn't ask why, didn't push. He just looked away, toward the fire, and let his head rest against the floor. "I'll leave soon as I can walk." "You will," Clara said. "But not today." He didn't argue. She turned back to the window, watching the light grow stronger across the valley. The storm was over. The damage was done. And now, in the quiet that followed, she was left with a stranger on her floor and a choice she'd already made. She didn't regret it. Not yet. But as the sun climbed higher and the shadows in the room began to shift, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That the man she'd pulled from the storm had brought more with him than just blood and rain. Something she couldn't name. Something that lingered in the air like the smell of smoke after a fire. The day passed slowly. Clara went about her work, feeding the chickens, checking the barn, clearing debris from the yard. The man stayed inside, asleep more often than not. She checked on him twice. Both times his breathing was steady. His color was better. The bandage held. By evening, the sky had cleared completely. Stars began to prick through the deepening blue, cold and distant. Clara made a simple meal. Cornbread, beans, a little salt pork. She set a plate aside for him and ate hers by the fire, listening to the quiet. When she looked over, his eyes were open again. "You hungry?" she asked. He nodded. She brought him the plate, helped him sit up enough to eat without choking. He took the food without a word, chewing slowly, carefully. When he finished, he handed the plate back and met her gaze. "What's your name?" Clara hesitated, then said, "Clara Wren." He nodded, looked away, and after a long moment he said, "Elias." "Elias what?" "Just Elias." She didn't press. She took the plate back to the table, rinsed it in the basin, and stood there with her hands in the water, staring out the window at the darkening prairie. Behind her, Elias spoke again. "Why'd you help me?" Clara turned, drying her hands on a cloth. "Because you needed it. That's all, that's all." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe her. Then he nodded, just once, and lay back down. Clara pulled the blanket over him and returned to her chair. Outside, the coyotes began to cry. The sound drifted across the valley, lonesome and wild, carried on the wind like a hymn. Clara listened, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the fire. She didn't know who Elias was. She didn't know where he'd come from, or what he was running from. But she knew one thing. The storm had brought him here, and for better or worse, he wasn't leaving yet. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of movement. She sat up quickly, blinking away sleep. The fire had burned low, the room was cold, and across the floor, Elias was sitting upright, his back against the wall, his injured legs stretched out in front of him. He looked at her. "Morning." Clara stood, pulling her shawl tight. "You shouldn't be moving." "I'm fine." "You're not." He almost smiled. "Almost. Maybe not. But I'm better." Clara crossed the room and crouched beside him, checking the bandage. The bleeding had stopped. The stitches held. The skin around the wound was red, but not angry, not infected. "You're lucky," she said quietly. "I know." She stood, walked to the stove, and began making coffee. The silence between them felt different now, not uncomfortable, just aware. After a while, Elias spoke. "How long you been out here alone?" Clara didn't turn. 2 years. Husband, dead. "I'm sorry." She poured the coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to him. He took it with both hands, holding it like it was something precious. "What happened?" he asked. Clara sat down across from him, cradling her own cup. "Fever. Came on fast. Took him in 3 days." Elias nodded slowly. "That's a hard way to go. They all are." He sipped the coffee, said nothing. Clara watched him over the rim of her cup. His face was still pale, but the sharpness in his eyes had returned. He looked stronger, steadier, but there was something else there too, something guarded, like a door that had been closed for a long time. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you out here?" Elias's jaw tightened. He stared down into his cup. "Wrong place, wrong time." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Clara let the silence sit. Then she stood, took his empty cup, and walked back to the stove. "You can stay till you're healed," she said. "But once you can walk, you're gone. Understood?" She glanced back at him. "And if anyone comes looking for you, they won't. If they do, they won't." Clara held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." She turned away, stirred the fire back to life, and let the warmth fill the room. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The prairie stretched wide and golden under the light, endless and unforgiving. And inside the old homestead, 2 people who'd been strangers the night before sat in silence, bound together by mercy and blood and the quiet weight of secrets neither of them was ready to speak. But when the sun rose over the drenched valley, Clara realized the traveler had left more behind than his broken step. He had left a quiet question in her heart. The third morning came soft. No rain, no wind. Just the pale wash of dawn spreading across the valley like spilled milk, turning the grass silver and the distant hills blue. Clara woke to the sound of birdsong, something she hadn't noticed in days. The storm had driven everything into silence. Now, slowly, the world was remembering how to sing. She sat up, rubbed the stiffness from her neck, and looked across the room. Elias was awake, sitting against the wall, his injured legs still stretched out, his eyes fixed on the window. He didn't turn when she moved, just kept staring at the light, as if he were trying to memorize it. Clara stood, folded the blanket she'd slept in, and walked to the stove. "You sleep at all?" she asked. "Some leg hurting?" "Always." She poured water into the kettle and set it on the heat. The metal clanged softly. Outside, a rooster crowed from somewhere near the barn. The sound felt strange, too normal, too ordinary, after everything that had happened. "I'll change the bandage after you eat," Clara said. Elias finally looked at her. "You don't have to keep doing this." "I know." "Then why are you—" Clara didn't answer right away. She cracked 2 eggs into a skillet, watched them sizzle and pop. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. "Because I started it," she said finally. "And I finish what I start." Elias said nothing. But when she glanced over, something had shifted in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, something quieter, something that looked like respect. She brought him a plate, eggs, a piece of hard bread, some dried meat. He ate slowly, carefully, like a man who hadn't had a decent meal in a long time. Clara ate hers standing by the window, watching the light grow stronger across the yard. When he finished, she took his plate and knelt beside him. "Let me see it." He didn't argue, just shifted his leg toward her and looked away. Clara unwrapped the bandage, peeling the cloth back gently. The wound was healing, slower than she'd like, but healing. The edges were pink, not red. The stitches held tight, no pus, no streaks of infection climbing toward his knee. "It's holding," she said. "Good." She cleaned it again, wrapped it in fresh cloth and tied it off. When she looked up, Elias was watching her. "You've done this before," he said. "Once or twice. You're good at it." Clara stood, gathering the soiled bandages. "I've had practice at things I didn't want to learn." He nodded slowly, didn't push. She walked to the basin, washed her hands, and stood there for a moment with her fingers in the cold water. Behind her, she heard Elias shift, heard the creak of floorboards as he tried to adjust his weight. "You should rest," she said without turning. "I've been resting for 3 days, and you'll rest for 3 more if you want that leg to work right." Elias exhaled, a sound somewhere between frustration and resignation. But he didn't argue. When Clara turned back, he'd leaned his head against the wall, his eyes half closed. She draped a blanket over him and left him there. The days began to blur together, not in a bad way, just soft, like the edges of things had rounded out, become less sharp. Elias stayed inside mostly. He slept, ate, watched the fire. Clara moved through her routines, tending the animals, mending fences, hauling water from the well. The work never ended. It never had. But now, when she came back inside, there was someone there, not talking, not demanding, just there. It changed the house. The silence wasn't so heavy anymore. The rooms didn't echo the way they used to. At night, when Clara sat by the fire, she could hear him breathing across the room, steady and low, and it made the darkness feel less empty. On the 5th day, Elias stood. Clara heard the sound before she saw it, the scrape of boots against wood, the soft grunt of effort. She turned from the stove just in time to see him push himself upright, one hand braced against the wall, his jaw clenched tight. "What are you doing?" she said sharply, walking. "You're not ready. I'm ready enough." He took one step, then another. His right leg dragged slightly, but he kept his weight on it, kept moving. Clara stayed where she was, hands on her hips, ready to catch him if he fell. He didn't fall. He made it to the table, gripped the edge, and stood there breathing hard. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he was standing. "See?" he said, glancing at her. "Fine." Clara crossed her arms. "You're an idiot." He almost smiled. "Probably. Sit down before you tear something open." He did, slowly, lowering himself into the chair with a grimace. Clara brought him water. He drank it in one long pull, then set the cup down and looked at her. "I need to start pulling my weight. You need to heal. I can do both." Clara shook her head. "You're stubborn." "So are you." She couldn't argue with that. The next morning she let him help. Not much, just small things. He peeled potatoes while she prepared the stove. He folded blankets while she swept the floor. He moved slowly, carefully, favoring his bad leg. But he moved, and bit by bit the house came alive in a way it hadn't in years. 2 people, 2 sets of hands, 2 voices breaking the silence. It felt strange. It felt good. A week after the storm, Clara went out to check the fence line near the creek. The rain had washed out part of the bank, and she needed to see how much damage had been done. She told Elias she'd be back by midday. He nodded, said nothing, and watched her go. The walk took longer than she expected. The ground was still soft, and the creek had swollen with runoff. She had to wade through mud up to her ankles just to reach the fence. 3 posts were down, the wire sagging into the water. She cursed under her breath and got to work. By the time she finished, the sun was high and hot. Her back ached, her hands were blistered. But the fence held. When she returned to the house, the door was open. Clara stopped in the yard, her stomach tightening. She hadn't left it open, she never did. "Elias?" No answer. She stepped inside, slow and cautious. He was standing by the window, his back to her, one hand braced against the frame. He didn't turn when she entered, just kept staring out at the ridge in the distance. "What's wrong?" Clara asked. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, "Riders." Clara crossed the room and looked out. Sure enough, 3 figures on horseback moved slowly along the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. They were too far away to see clearly, but even from here, she could tell they were searching for something. "You know them?" she asked. Elias's jaw tightened. "No, you're lying." He looked at her then. Sharp, defensive. "I don't know them, but I know what they are, which is trouble." Clara held his gaze. "For you or for me? For both of us if they come down here." The riders moved on, disappearing over the ridge. But the tension in the room didn't ease. Elias stepped back from the window, his hand falling to his side. For the first time since she'd pulled him from the storm, Clara saw something close to fear in his eyes. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. He turned away. "Nothing I'm proud of. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to press him, wanted to demand the truth. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his shoulders had tensed. Maybe it was the way he wouldn't look at her. Or maybe it was because, deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "If they come here," she said slowly, "I need to know what I'm dealing with." Elias looked at her over his shoulder. "If they come here, you tell them you don't know me. You found me bleeding, patched me up, and sent me on my way. That's it. And if they don't believe, they will." "How do you know?" "Because you're a terrible liar." Clara blinked. Then, despite everything, she felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "You're not wrong." Elias exhaled. Something that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so tired. He limped back to the chair and sat down heavily, his hand going to his leg. Clara watched him for a long moment. Then she walked to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee, and brought one to him. "Here." He took it without a word. They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken things settling between them like dust. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The chicken scratched in the dirt. The wind whispered through the grass. And inside the old homestead, 2 people who'd been strangers just days ago sat together, bound by mercy and secrets and the quiet understanding that some questions were better left unasked. For now. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, really just a narrow cot in the corner of the room, and stared at the ceiling. The fire had burned down to embers. The house was dark. Across the room she could hear Elias breathing, slow and steady, but her mind wouldn't stop. The riders, his fear, the way he'd looked at that ridge like it was a guillotine waiting to fall. What had he done? And more importantly, what had she gotten herself into? Clara turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Through the window she could see stars scattered across the black sky, cold and distant. She thought about her husband, about the fever that had taken him, about the 2 years she'd spent alone in this house, learning how to survive without him. She'd gotten good at it, at being alone, maybe too good. Because now, with Elias here, she realized how much she'd missed the sound of another person, the warmth of another presence, the simple, quiet comfort of not being the only voice in the house. And that scared her, because people left. They always did, one way or another. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. The next morning, Elias was already awake when Clara stirred. He sat at the table, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing something on a scrap of wood. Clara sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What are you doing?" He didn't look up, thinking, "About what?" "Your barn." She frowned, walked over. He tilted the wood toward her. On it, he'd sketched a rough design. Beams, supports, a frame for a new roof. "It's falling apart," he said. "If we get another storm like the last one, it'll collapse." "I know. I can fix it." Clara stared at him. "You can barely walk." "I can stand. I can hammer. That's enough." "Elias, I'm not asking permission," he said, meeting her eyes. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Because the truth was, he was right. The barn was a disaster. She'd been putting it off for months, maybe longer, and if it came down, she'd lose the animals, the feed, everything. "Fine," she said. "But if you rip those stitches open, I'm not fixing you again." He smiled, small but real. "Deal." They worked through the morning. Elias moved slowly, his limp still pronounced, but he didn't stop. He measured beams, marked cuts, tested the strength of old posts. Clara hauled wood, held boards steady while he nailed them in place, and tried not to think about how strange it felt to be working beside someone again. By midday, they'd replaced 2 support beams and patched a section of the roof. Sweat dripped down Clara's back. Her arms ached, but when she stepped back and looked at what they'd done, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Elias leaned against the barn wall, breathing hard, his shirt dark with sweat. He looked exhausted. But when he met her gaze, he was smiling. "Not bad," he said. Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "Not bad at all." They stood there in the shade, catching their breath, the sound of the wind moving through the valley around them. And for a moment, just a moment, Clara let herself imagine what it would be like if this were permanent. If Elias stayed, if they kept working side by side, fixing things, building things, making this broken place whole again. But then she remembered the riders, the fear in his eyes, the secrets he carried like stones in his pockets. And she knew he wasn't staying. He couldn't. So she pushed the thought away, picked up her hammer, and went back to work. That evening they sat on the porch together. It wasn't something they'd planned. It just happened. Clara had brought out 2 cups of coffee, and Elias had followed her outside, lowering himself onto the step with a grimace. They sat side by side, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "It's beautiful," Elias said quietly. Clara nodded. "It is. How long you been out here?" "Since I married. 10 years, give or take. You ever think about leaving?" Clara sipped her coffee. "Every day. But you don't." "No. Why?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Because it's mine, and I'm not done with it yet." Elias nodded slowly, as if he understood something she hadn't said. They sat in silence, the light fading, the stars beginning to appear. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Another answered. "You ever think about staying in one place?" Clara asked. Elias's jaw tightened. "Sometimes. But you can't. Why?" He looked at her, his eyes shadowed in the growing dark. "Because some men don't get to stay." Clara wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to press him, to pull the truth out of him like thread from a wound, but she didn't, because she could see it in his face, the weight he carried, the guilt, the fear, and she knew that whatever he'd done, whatever he was running from, it wasn't something he could put into words. Not yet, maybe not ever. So she just nodded, finished her coffee, and stood. "Get some rest," she said. "We've got more work tomorrow." Elias looked up at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Clara." She paused. "Thank you." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded again and went inside. Behind her, Elias stayed on the porch, staring out at the darkening valley, and long after Clara had gone to bed, he sat there, alone with the stars and the wind and the ghosts that followed him wherever he went. The next morning, Clara woke to silence. Not the comfortable silence of the past few days. Something else. Something wrong. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Elias's bedroll was empty. Clara threw off her blanket and stood, scanning the room. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. The revolver he'd kept tucked under his pillow, gone. She crossed to the window and looked out. His horse was still in the barn, but the gate stood open, swinging gently in the breeze. Clara grabbed her shawl and hurried outside. The yard was empty. The prairie stretched wide and silent under the morning light. She called his name, her voice sharp and loud. No answer. She walked around the house, checked the barn, the creek, the fence line. Nothing. And then, just as panic began to tighten in her chest, she saw him. Elias stood at the edge of her property, near the old oak tree, his back to the house. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring out at the ridge where the riders had been. Clara walked toward him, her boots crunching in the dry grass. "Elias." He didn't turn. "What are you doing?" "Thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, he said, "About whether I should leave now or wait till I get you killed." Clara stopped a few feet behind him. Her chest tightened. "Is that what you think you're doing?" she asked. "Getting me killed? I think I'm a danger to you, and I think you deserve better than that. That's not your choice to make. It is if I'm the one who brought it here." Clara stepped forward, moved around him until she could see his face. His jaw was set, his eyes hard. "If you want to leave, leave," she said. "But don't do it because you think you're protecting me. I've survived worse than you." Elias looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "You don't know what I've done." "You're right, I don't, and maybe I don't need to." "Clara, you think you're the first broken thing I've let into this house?" Her voice was steady but fierce. "This land breaks everyone, but some of us put ourselves back together. So if you're waiting for me to send you away out of fear, you'll be waiting a long time." Elias stared at her. For a moment he looked like he wanted to argue. Then his shoulders sagged, and he turned away. "You're a fool," he said quietly. "Probably." He shook his head, but when he looked back at her, there was something softer in his eyes. Something that looked almost like relief. "All right," he said. "I'll stay. For now." Clara nodded. "Good." They walked back to the house together, side by side, the morning light warming their backs. And when they stepped through the door, the house felt different again. Not lighter, exactly, but steadier. Like something that had been leaning had finally found its balance. Neither of them spoke. But when Elias sat down at the table and Clara handed him a cup of coffee, their fingers brushed, just for a second, and neither of them pulled away. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The sun climbed higher, and the valley stretched wide and golden, holding its secrets close. And when he finally saddled his horse to leave, the silence he left behind felt heavier than any storm. The sun rose warmer now. Spring was creeping in, slow but sure, softening the edges of winter. The grass grew taller, greener. Wildflowers appeared in scattered patches along the creek, pale yellow, deep purple, white as bone. The air smelled different too, less like cold stone and more like earth waking up. Elias stayed, not because he'd made a promise, not because he couldn't leave, but because something in him had stopped running, at least for now. And Clara let him stay. Not out of pity, but because the house had remembered what it was like to hold two people instead of one. They fell into a rhythm. Clara woke first, always. She'd build up the fire, start the coffee, and by the time the kettle whistled, Elias would be awake too. They'd eat in comfortable silence. Eggs, bread, whatever was left from the day before. Then, they'd go to work. The barn came first. It took them another week to finish it, replacing rotted beams, reshingling the roof, patching holes where wind and rain had worn through. Elias worked with his hands like a man who'd done it before. He measured twice, cut once, never wasted a nail. Clara watched him sometimes when he wasn't looking, watched the way he'd tilt his head, considering a joint, or the way his jaw would set when he lifted something too heavy. His limp was still there, probably always would be, but it didn't slow him much anymore. One afternoon, as they worked side by side replacing a section of siding, Clara asked, "Where'd you learn to do this?" Elias didn't look up. "My father. He a carpenter? He was a lot of things." Clara waited, but he didn't say more. Just kept hammering, the rhythm steady and sure. She didn't push. By the end of the second week, the barn stood straight and solid, the roof tight against the sky. They stepped back together, sweating in the afternoon heat, and looked at what they'd done. "It'll hold," Elias said. Clara nodded. "It will." They stood there a moment longer. Then Clara smiled, small but real, and said, "Thank you." Elias glanced at her, something flickering in his eyes. "You helped. I held the ladder. You built it. That's not nothing." Clara looked at him, and for a second, the space between them felt smaller, closer. Like the distance they'd kept since the day she pulled him from the storm had started to collapse. Then Elias turned away, picked up his tools, and walked back toward the house. Clara watched him go, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. The fence line was next. It stretched for miles, old wires strung between weathered posts, most of them leaning or broken. Clara had been meaning to fix it for over a year, but it was too much work for one person. Now, with Elias, it felt possible. They started at the north end, near the creek, and worked their way south. Elias dug new post holes while Clara pulled down the old wire and coiled it for scrap. It was hard, slow work. The ground was still half frozen in places, and the wire cut through gloves like it was alive. But they didn't stop. Day after day, they moved down the line, digging, planting, stretching wire tight between posts. Some days they talked. Elias told her about horses he'd known, towns he'd passed through, roads that stretched so long you forgot where they started. Clara told him about the crops her husband used to plant, the winter they'd lost half the herd to sickness, the way the valley looked when the first snow came. They didn't talk about the past, not really, not the heavy parts, But the stories they did share painted pictures of who they'd been once. Before loss, before running. Other days they worked in silence. And that was good too. One afternoon, as they stood on opposite sides of a post, stretching wire between them, Clara said, "You ever think about settling down?" Elias pulled the wire taut, his knuckles white. "Used to. What changed?" "Life." Clara tied off her end and looked at him across the space. "That's a coward's answer." Elias's jaw tightened. "Maybe I'm a coward. You're not." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression cracked. Not much, just enough to let a little light in. "I had a place once," he said quietly, "down near the border. Little cabin on a piece of land no one else wanted. Thought I'd make something of it. What happened? Someone took it." "How?" Elias's hands stilled on the wire. His voice went flat, the way people always do, with lawyers and lies and men with guns. Clara didn't say anything, just waited. "I fought it," Elias continued. "Took it to court, hired a lawyer, did everything the right way. But the man who wanted my land had more money, more friends, more power. The judge ruled against me, said I didn't have proper claim, that I'd forged the deed. Did you?" Elias looked at her, his eyes hard. "No." Clara believed him. "So you left," she said. "Not right away." His voice dropped. "First I went back, tried to take what was mine. And when they came to throw me off, things got out of hand." "How out of hand?" Elias's hands tightened on the wire. "A barn burned, a man got hurt, and I ran before they could hang me for it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara stood very still, the wire trembling in her hands. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to hold what he'd just given her. But she didn't let go of the wire, and she didn't walk away. "Did you set the fire?" she asked quietly. Elias looked at her. "I don't know. How do you not know?" "Because I was drunk, and angry, and half dead already. And by the time I came to, the place was burning, and men were shouting, and I just ran." Clara exhaled slowly. "So you've been running ever since?" "Yeah." "And those riders are probably looking for me?" "Yeah." Silence settled between them, heavy and fragile. Then Clara said, "You should have told me. I know. I had a right to know what I was bringing into my house." "You did." She looked at him, this man who'd stumbled into her life bleeding and broken, who'd worked beside her and fixed her barn and stood here now with his whole past laid bare. And she made a choice. "All right," she said. Elias blinked. "All right. You told me. Now I know. So let's finish this fence and go home." He stared at her like she'd spoken a different language. "That's it? What else do you want me to say? I don't know. That I'm a criminal. That you're turning me in. That—" "Elias," Clara's voice was firm, "I pulled you out of a storm because you needed help. That hasn't changed. So unless you're planning to burn my barn down, we're done talking about this." Elias looked at her for a long time. Then slowly, something in his face softened. "You're the strangest woman I've ever met," he said. Clara smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." She turned back to the fence and kept working, and after a moment, so did he. The days grew longer. The sun stayed high later into the evening, painting the valley in gold and amber. Clara and Elias finished the fence line, patched the roof on the chicken coop, and cleared a new plot for planting. The work never ended, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like building something. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Clara stood in the yard and looked at everything they'd done. The barn straight and strong, the fence tight and true, the garden plot dark and ready for seed. It looked like hope. Elias came up beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. "What are you thinking? That this place hasn't looked this good in years? You did most of it. We did most of it." Elias didn't argue, just stood there beside her, watching the light fade. After a while, Clara said, "You ever think about staying?" He didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, "Every day." Clara's heart skipped. "But you won't." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because the men looking for me won't stop. And when they find me, they'll burn everything I touch." "You don't know that." "I do." Clara turned to face him. "So what? You're just going to keep running forever, if that's what it takes, to keep you safe?" "Yeah." The words hit her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally said, "I didn't ask you to protect me." "I know. Then don't use me as an excuse." Elias looked at her, something raw in his eyes. It's not an excuse. Then what is it? It's the truth. They stood there in the fading light, the space between them charged with everything they hadn't said. Then Clara turned and walked back toward the house. Elias didn't follow. That night, Clara couldn't sleep again. She lay in her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Elias breathing across the room. Her chest felt tight, her mind wouldn't stop turning. He was going to leave. She'd known it from the start. Known it every time he looked at the ridge, every time his hand went to his revolver, every time he checked the horizon like a man expecting judgment. But knowing it didn't make it easier. Because somewhere along the way, between the storm and the barn and the fence line, she'd started to care. Not just about whether he lived or died, but about whether he stayed or went. And that terrified her. Because people left. They always did. Clara closed her eyes and tried to sleep. The next morning, Elias was gone. Clara woke to an empty room, her heart sinking. She stood quickly, pulled on her boots, and hurried outside. But this time, he hadn't left. He was out by the orchard, what was left of it anyway. A dozen gnarled apple trees that hadn't been pruned in years, their branches wild and tangled. Elias stood beneath one, a saw in his hand, studying the limbs. Clara walked over, her arms crossed. "What are you doing?" "Fixing this." "The orchard?" "Yeah." "Why?" Elias glanced at her. "Because it needs it." Clara looked at the trees. Old, neglected, half dead. Her husband had planted them years ago, back when he still believed the land could give more than it took. After he died, she'd let them go. "I don't know if they'll come back," she said quietly. "Only one way to find out." Elias turned back to the tree and started cutting. Slowly, carefully, he removed the dead branches, the crossed limbs, the growth that choked the center. Clara watched for a while, then picked up a pair of shears and started on the next tree. They worked through the morning, pruning and clearing, until the orchard looked less like a graveyard and more like something that might bloom again. When they finished, they stood back, sweating and tired. "Think they'll make it?" Elias asked. Clara looked at the trees, bare and stark, but clean now, breathing. "Maybe," she said. Elias nodded. "That's enough." The days slipped by like water. Elias taught Clara how to ride again, really ride, not just sit on a horse and hope it knew where to go. He showed her how to balance, how to move with the animal, how to trust it. She was terrible at first, fell off twice, but she got back on, and by the end of the week, she could gallop across the valley without holding the saddle horn, her hair flying behind her, her laughter cutting through the wind. Elias watched from the fence, smiling in a way she'd never seen before. In return, Clara taught him how to cook, really cook, not just fry meat and boil beans. She showed him how to bake bread, how to season a stew, how to make something that tasted like home. He burned the first loaf. The second one came out flat. But the third was perfect, golden and soft, steam rising when they tore it open. They ate it on the porch, still warm, and didn't say a word. They didn't need to. One afternoon, Clara found Elias in the dirt near the barn, sketching again. She crouched beside him. "What is it this time?" He didn't look up. "An extension. For what?" "The house." Clara's breath caught. "Why?" Elias finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Because it's too small." "For who?" He didn't answer. Just looked back at the drawing. A simple addition, a new room off the side, a window facing east. Clara stared at it, her heart pounding. "Elias, I know," he said quietly. "I know I can't stay. But I thought, maybe I could leave you something that lasts." Clara didn't know what to say, so she just sat down beside him and looked at the sketch, at the house that could have been, at the dream he was drawing in the dirt, and for a moment, she let herself believe it was real. That evening, as the sun set crimson over the valley, they sat on the porch again. The air was warm, the sky was clear. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang. "You ever regret it?" Elias asked. "Regret what?" "Pulling me out of that storm." Clara thought about it, about the fear, the blood, the secrets, about the way her life had changed in the days since. "No," she said. "Even knowing what I am, especially knowing what you are." Elias looked at her, something soft and aching in his eyes. "Why?" he asked. Clara met his gaze. Because you reminded me what it's like to not be alone. The words hung in the air, fragile and true. Elias reached out, slow, careful, and took her hand. Clara didn't pull away. They sat there as the light faded, their fingers intertwined, the valley spreading wide and silent around them. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt like they were running. They just felt like they were home. But as the stars began to appear one by one, Clara saw it. A flicker of movement on the ridge. She squeezed Elias's hand. He saw it too. 3 riders silhouetted against the dying light. Watching. Waiting. Elias's jaw tightened. His hand went to the revolver at his hip. "They found me," he said quietly. Clara's heart sank. "What do we do?" Elias stood, his eyes fixed on the ridge. "I leave. Tonight, Elias. I won't let them hurt you." Clara stood too, her hands shaking. "And if I won't let you go?" He looked at her, his eyes full of pain and something else. Something that looked like love. "Then you're a fool," he said. "I've been called worse." Elias almost smiled. Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead, soft, brief, like a goodbye. "Thank you," he whispered. And before Clara could say another word, he turned and walked toward the barn. She stood on the porch, frozen, her heart breaking. Behind her, the house stood silent. Before her, the valley stretched dark and endless, and on the ridge, the riders waited. But just as spring painted the valley gold, dust clouds rose on the horizon, and the peace they'd built began to tremble. Morning came too soon. Clara woke to the sound of hooves on hard ground, slow, deliberate, the rhythm of men who knew they had time. She sat up fast, her heart already racing, and looked across the room. Elias's bedroll was still there. He hadn't left. He stood by the window, fully dressed, his hand resting on the frame. His revolver hung at his hip. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on something outside. When he heard her move, he didn't turn. "How many?" Clara asked, her voice rough with sleep. "3. She stood, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and crossed to the window. 3 riders moved down from the ridge in a loose line, their horses picking their way through the tall grass. Even from a distance, Clara could see the glint of metal on their chests. Badges, lawmen, or men pretending to be. They weren't hurrying. They didn't need to. "You should have left last night," Clara said quietly. "I know." "Then why didn't you?" Elias finally looked at her. His face was tired, shadowed. "Because I'm done running." Clara's chest tightened. "Elias, they'll ask questions," he said, his voice calm. Too calm. "You tell them the truth. You found me bleeding in the storm. You patched me up. That's all. And if they don't believe me, they will." "How do you know?" "Because you're not a liar, Clara." He turned back to the window. "And because I'll tell them the same thing." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to grab him, shake him, demand he run while he still could. But the riders were already crossing into the yard, and there was no time left. Elias stepped away from the window and walked to the door. "Stay inside," he said. "No, Clara. It's my house. I'll stand where I damn well please." Elias looked at her, something between frustration and admiration flickering in his eyes. Then he nodded once and opened the door. Clara followed him out onto the porch. The 3 riders stopped 10 feet from the steps. Their horses stamped and blew, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. The men sat tall in their saddles, their coats dusty, their faces hard. The one in the middle, older, gray-bearded with a badge pinned to his chest, studied Elias with the kind of patience that came from years of hunting men. "Morning," the man said. His voice was low, gravelly. Elias didn't move. "Morning." The lawman's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Elias. "You the owner of this property?" "I am," Clara said, stepping forward. "This is my land." The lawman tipped his hat. "Ma'am, name's Marshal Harding. These are my deputies." He gestured to the men on either side of him, one young and twitchy, the other broad-shouldered and silent. "We're looking for a man. Thought you might have seen him." "What's he look like?" Clara asked. "Tall, dark hair, walks with a limp." Harding's gaze shifted to Elias. "Looks a lot like your friend here." Clara's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "What's he wanted for?" "Arson, assault, destruction of property." Harding leaned forward in his saddle. "There was a dispute over land down near the border. Things got ugly. A barn burned. A man got hurt bad. And this fellow," he nodded at Elias, "disappeared before anyone could ask him about it." Elias said nothing. His hand hung loose at his side, close to his revolver. Clara stepped between them. He came here during the storm, bleeding, half dead. I took him in, patched him up. He's been helping with repairs in exchange for food and shelter. That's all. Harding studied her. That's so. It is. And you didn't think to ask what he was running from? I didn't care. The marshal's eyebrows lifted. Didn't care. No. Ma'am, you understand this man is wanted for serious crimes. I understand you are accusing him of crimes, Clara said. That's not the same thing. Harding's jaw tightened. He looked past her at Elias. You got anything to say for yourself? Elias met his gaze. I didn't set that fire. You saying you weren't there. I was there, but I didn't set it. Then who did? I don't know. Could have been anyone. Could have been the men trying to run me off my own land. Your land. Harding's voice dripped with skepticism. The court said otherwise. The court was paid to say otherwise. That's a heavy accusation. It's the truth. Harding leaned back in his saddle, his eyes cold. You got proof? I had proof. It burned with everything else. The marshal studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Ma'am, I'm going to give you some advice. This man is trouble. Whatever mercy you've shown him, it's misplaced. You send him on his way now and we'll pretend we never saw him here. You let him stay, and when things go bad, and they will, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. Clara's hands curled into fists. You done? Harding blinked. Excuse me? I said, are you done? Clara stepped forward, her voice sharp. Because unless you've got a warrant, you're on my property uninvited, and I'm asking you to leave. The young deputy shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. The broad-shouldered one didn't move at all, just watched with flat, unreadable eyes. Harding raised a hand, stopping them. Ma'am, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly, Clara said. You've come here with accusations and no proof. You've threatened me on my own land, and now you're trying to scare me into turning out a man who's done nothing but help me. She took another step forward. So I'll say it one more time. Get off my property. Silence. The wind moved through the grass. A crow called from the barn roof. The horses stamped and blew. Harding's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake. It's mine to make. The marshal stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned his gaze to Elias. This isn't over. Elias said nothing. Harding pulled his reins, turning his horse. The other two followed. They rode back across the yard, slow and deliberate, their silhouettes dark against the morning light. But at the edge of the property, Harding stopped. He looked back over his shoulder, his voice carrying across the distance. That man you're sheltering? He's got blood on his hands. Maybe not from the fire, but from something. And when it catches up to him, it'll catch you too. Then he spurred his horse, and the three of them rode back toward the ridge. Clara stood on the porch, her legs shaking, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, Elias let out a slow breath. You shouldn't have done that, he said quietly. Clara turned to face him. What was I supposed to do? Let them take you? Yes. No. Clara, don't. Her voice broke. Don't tell me I should have let them drag you away. Don't tell me I should have believed them over you, because I won't. Elias stared at her, his face pale. Why? Because I know you, Clara said. Maybe not everything, but enough. You don't know what I've done. I know what you've done here. I know you fixed my barn. I know you mended my fences. I know you stayed when you could have run. Her voice softened. That's enough. Elias looked away, his jaw working. They were right about one thing. I am trouble. I know, and they'll come back. I know that too. Then why? Because some things are worth the trouble. The words hung between them, raw and true. Elias closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. I don't deserve you, he said. Clara smiled, sad and small. Good thing it's not about what you deserve. The rest of the day passed in silence. Elias didn't speak, didn't eat. He just sat on the porch, staring out at the ridge, his hand never far from his revolver. Clara tried to work, feeding the chickens, checking the garden plot, hauling water from the well. But her hands shook. Her mind wouldn't settle. She kept seeing Harding's face, hearing his words. That man you're sheltering? He's got blood on his hands. Was it true? She didn't know. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure it mattered, because somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing Elias as a stranger, stopped seeing him as a man who'd stumbled into her life by accident. She saw him as someone who'd stayed, someone who'd worked beside her, laughed with her, built something with her, someone who felt like home, and now that home was fracturing. By evening, the sky had turned bruised and heavy. Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm coming. Clara brought Elias a plate of food and set it beside him on the porch. He didn't touch it. "You need to eat," she said. "I'm not hungry." "Elias, they'll be back, Clara." His voice was flat. "Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they'll come, and when they do, they won't be so polite." Clara sat down beside him. "Then we'll deal with it. There's no we in this. It's me they want, and it's my house they'll have to come through to get you." Elias looked at her, something desperate in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked out at the valley, the land she'd fought to keep, the land that had taken so much from her, the land that had given her Elias. "Because I'm tired of losing things," she said quietly. Elias's breath hitched. He reached out, hesitated, then took her hand. They sat there as the storm rolled in, their fingers intertwined, the sky darkening above them. And for a little while, the world felt smaller, safer, but it didn't last. That night, Clara woke to the sound of something breaking. She sat up fast, her heart hammering. Across the room, Elias was already on his feet, revolver in hand. "What was that?" Clara whispered. "I don't know." Another sound, wood splintering, glass shattering. Elias moved to the window and looked out. His face went pale. "What is it?" Clara asked. He didn't answer, just grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Clara followed. Outside, the barn was on fire. Flames clawed up the sides, bright and furious, lighting the yard in shades of orange and red. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and black. The horses screamed from inside. "No," Clara breathed. Elias was already running. He kicked the barn door open, disappeared into the smoke. Clara ran after him, her shawl pulled over her mouth. The heat hit her like a wall. The smoke burned her eyes, her lungs. She could hear Elias shouting, hear the horses thrashing. She stumbled forward, blind, choking. Then Elias was there, leading a horse by the halter. He shoved the reins into Clara's hands. "Get it out!" he shouted. "Go!" She pulled the horse, through the door, out into the yard. It bolted the moment it was free, disappearing into the darkness. Clara turned back. Elias was gone again, back in the smoke. She tried to follow, but the flames were too high now. The roof groaned, buckled. Sparks rained down like stars. "Elias!" she screamed. "Nothing. Elias!" And then he was there, stumbling out of the smoke, another horse beside him. His face was black with soot. His hands were burned. The second horse ran free. Elias collapsed in the dirt, coughing, gasping. Clara dropped beside him. "Are you all right?" He couldn't answer, just nodded, his chest heaving. Behind them, the barn roof collapsed with a roar, sending embers high into the night. Clara stared at it. The barn they'd fixed together, the work they'd done, burning to ash. And she knew. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out. All that remained was a skeleton. Blackened beams, twisted metal, ash. The horses were gone, scattered into the valley. The yard was covered in soot. Clara stood at the edge of the wreckage, numb. Elias stood beside her, his hands wrapped in cloth. He hadn't spoken since the fire. Finally, Clara said, "They did this." Elias nodded. "Harding. Or someone like him. Why? To scare you. To make you send me away." Clara's hands curled into fists. "It won't work." Elias looked at her. "Clara, I said it won't work. Look at this." He gestured to the ruin. "Look at what they did. And this is just the start. I don't care. You should. Well, I don't." Clara turned to face him, her eyes burning. "You hear me? I don't care what they do. I'm not sending you away." Elias stared at her, his face full of pain. "You're going to get yourself killed. Then I'll die standing." He shook his head, his eyes wet. "Why are you so damn stubborn?" "Because I've already lost everything once," Clara said, her voice breaking. "And I'm not doing it again." Elias reached for her, pulled her close. She buried her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking. And as the sun climbed higher over the ruins, they stood together, two people holding on to something they both knew was already slipping away. That afternoon, Clara found the note. It was pinned to the fence post near the gate, weighted down with a stone. She pulled it loose, unfolded it. The handwriting was rough, scratched in charcoal. "You had your warning. Next time, it's the house." Clara stared at the words until they blurred. Then she walked back inside, handed the note to Elias and said nothing. He read it. His jaw tightened. "I'm leaving tonight," he said. Clara shook her head. No, Clara, no. They'll burn everything. They'll hurt you. I won't let that happen. Then don't. Clara's voice was fierce. Stay, fight, but don't you dare run because you think you're protecting me. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and something inside him broke. I can't lose you, he whispered. Clara stepped forward and took his face in her hands. Then stay. For a long moment they stood there, the world collapsing around them. Then Elias kissed her. It wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate and aching and full of everything they'd been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were trembling. I'll stay, Elias said, but only if you promise me something. What? If they come for me, you let them take me? You don't fight, you don't argue, you just let me go. Clara's chest tightened. I can't promise that. You have to, Elias. Please. She looked into his eyes, gray and desperate and full of love. And finally she nodded. All right. It was a lie. They both knew it. But for now, it was enough. That night Clara didn't sleep. She lay in her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to Elias breathe across the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the ash. The ruins of the barn stood black against the stars. And somewhere on the ridge, men were watching, waiting, planning. Clara closed her eyes and tried to memorize the sound of Elias breathing, because deep down, she knew. No matter what promises they made, no matter how hard they fought, the end was already coming. When dawn came, his bed was empty, and a note lay folded beside the fire, weighed down by her wedding ring. Clara woke to silence, not the comfortable silence she'd grown used to, the sound of Elias breathing across the room, the quiet rhythm of two people existing in the same space. This was different. Hollow. The kind of silence that pressed against your chest until you couldn't breathe. She sat up slowly, already knowing. His bedroll was empty, neatly folded. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. The revolver that usually sat within arm's reach, gone. But something else sat in its place. On the table beside the dying fire, a piece of paper lay folded, held down by a small object that caught the morning light. Clara's wedding ring. She'd taken it off 2 years ago, after her husband died. Couldn't bear to wear it anymore. It had sat in a drawer, forgotten until Elias must have found it. Clara's hands shook as she reached for the note. The paper was rough, torn from the edge of an old flour sack. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, like he'd written and rewritten it in his mind before putting it down. Clara, I'm sorry. I know what I promised. I know what you asked of me. But I can't watch them burn your life to the ground because of me. You gave me something I didn't deserve. Mercy, when the world had none. A home, when I'd forgotten what that word meant. And for a little while, you made me believe I could be more than what I'd become. But men like me don't get to stay. We carry too much weight, and I won't let you carry it with me. I'm leaving your ring because I want you to remember what you had before I came, what you still have, a good heart, a strong will, a life worth protecting. Don't follow me, don't wait for me, just live. E. Clara read it once, then again. Then a third time, her vision blurring. Then she crumpled the paper in her fist and screamed. The sound tore out of her, raw and furious and broken. It echoed through the empty house, bounced off the walls, filled every corner that Elias had once occupied. She stood, threw the note into the fire, and watched it burn. Then she grabbed her shawl and walked outside. The yard was gray in the early light. The ruins of the barn stood like a monument to everything they'd built and lost. Ash drifted on the wind. The fence they'd mended together stretched into the distance, marking boundaries that suddenly felt meaningless. Clara walked to the gate, her boots crunching through the soot. She could see his tracks, boot prints leading away from the house, heading north toward the ridge. He'd left on foot. Probably figured taking a horse would be stealing, even after everything. Even now, he was trying to do the right thing. Clara wanted to scream again, wanted to saddle her horse and chase him down, drag him back, force him to stay. But she didn't, because deep down, beneath the anger and the grief, she understood. He was trying to save her the only way he knew how, by leaving. Clara stood at the gate for a long time, staring at the horizon where his footprints disappeared. Then she turned and walked back to the house. The first week was the hardest. Clara threw herself into work, anything to keep her hands busy, her mind occupied. She cleared the ash from the barn, salvaged what little metal and wood hadn't burned. She repaired the chicken coop roof. She dug a new irrigation channel to the garden plot. The work was exhausting, endless, but it wasn't enough. Because every time she walked past the porch, she remembered sitting there beside him, their hands intertwined, watching the sun set. Every time she boiled coffee, she poured 2 cups out of habit, then stared at the second one until it went cold. Every time she went to bed, she looked at the empty bedroll across the room and felt the silence press down on her like a physical weight. He was gone. And the house remembered. By the second week, the whispers started. Clara rode into Bitter Creek to buy supplies: nails, flour, salt. The moment she walked into the general store, the conversation stopped. People turned to look at her, then quickly looked away. The shopkeeper, a thin man named Wendell with nervous hands, barely met her eyes as he tallied her purchases. "That'll be $4, he said quietly. Clara paid, loaded her supplies into the wagon, and turned to leave. That's when she heard it. 2 women standing near the fabric display, their voices low but not low enough, heard she was harboring a criminal. The widow Wren, yes. They say he burned that barn himself. Marshall came all the way from the border looking for him, and she sent them away. Can you imagine?" Clara's jaw tightened. She kept walking. Behind her, one of the women spoke louder, as if she wanted to be heard. "Some people have no sense, no decency." Clara stopped. She turned slowly and looked at the woman, middle-aged, well-dressed, her face pinched with judgment. "You have something to say to me?" Clara asked. The woman blinked. Because if you're going to talk about me, you should have the courage to do it to my face." The woman's face flushed red. "I was simply saying—" "I know what you were saying." Clara stepped forward. "You think I don't know what people are whispering? You think I don't hear the way you all stop talking when I walk by? We're just concerned." "You're not concerned. You're judging. There's a difference." The second woman spoke up, her voice sharp. "Mrs. Wren, you helped a wanted man. You defied the law. What did you expect people to think?" Clara looked at her. "I expected people to mind their own damn business." The store went silent. Wendell shifted behind the counter, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Clara picked up her supplies and walked out. But as she climbed into the wagon, she felt their eyes on her back, felt the weight of their judgment, their whispers, their righteousness. And for the first time since Elias left, she felt truly alone. The third week brought rain, not a storm like the one that had brought Elias to her door, just steady gray drizzle that turned the world soft and blurred. Clara sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the water run off the roof. She thought about the first night, the way he'd looked, half dead, bleeding, his face pale in the lantern light, the way she'd hesitated before opening the door. If she could go back, would she do it differently? Would she leave him out there in the storm? No, she wouldn't, even knowing how it ended, even knowing the cost, because for a little while she hadn't been alone, and that was worth something, maybe even worth everything. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the rain. By the 4th week, the anger set in, not at Elias, at the men who'd driven him away, at Harding and his deputies, at the land baron who'd stolen Elias's home and made him a fugitive, at the system that protected the powerful and crushed everyone else. Clara lay awake at night, imagining what she'd say if Harding came back, imagining the ways she'd make him answer for what he'd done. But he didn't come back. None of them did. They'd gotten what they wanted. Elias was gone. Clara was alone again. The threat was over, and that made it worse, because it meant everything. The fire, the fear, the loss had been for nothing. One evening, as Clara sat by the fire mending a torn shirt, she heard hooves outside. Her heart leapt. She stood quickly, dropping the shirt, and moved to the window. But it wasn't Elias. It was a man she didn't recognize, older, weathered, riding a mule. He stopped in the yard and called out, "Hello, the house." Clara grabbed the rifle from above the door and stepped onto the porch. "State your business." The man raised his hands. "Easy, ma'am. I'm not here to cause trouble. Name's Cutler. I'm a traveler, just looking for a place to water my mule and maybe buy a meal if you're selling." Clara studied him. He looked harmless enough. Thin, tired, his clothes patched and faded. "I'm not selling," she said. Cutler nodded. "Fair enough. Water then? I'll pay." Clara hesitated, then lowered the rifle. "There's a trough by the barn. Help yourself." "Much obliged." He led his mule to the trough, let it drink. Clara stayed on the porch, rifle in hand, watching. When the mule had drunk its fill, Cutler tipped his hat. "Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate the kindness." He started to leave, then paused. You hear about the trouble up north? Clara frowned. What trouble? Land dispute. Big one. Baron named Colfax has been running settlers off their claims for months, burning homes, threatening families, but word is someone's finally standing up to him. Clara's chest tightened. Who? Don't know his name. Just heard he's gathering folks. People who lost their land, people who want to fight back. They say he's building something. A coalition, maybe. A reckoning. Clara's breath caught. Where? Cutler shrugged. Near the Ridge country, last I heard. Past the border. But that's just rumor. Could be nothing. He tipped his hat again and rode off, his mule plodding slowly into the dusk. Clara stood on the porch, her heart pounding. Elias. It had to be. That night, Clara sat at the table, staring at her wedding ring. She'd picked it up after Elias left, put it back in the drawer where it belonged. But tonight, she took it out again, held it in her palm, felt its weight. Elias had left it as a reminder, as a symbol of what she'd had before him, what she could have again. But he'd been wrong, because Clara didn't want what she'd had before. She wanted what she'd had with him. The house that wasn't so quiet, the work that didn't feel so heavy, the nights that didn't stretch so long. She wanted him. And maybe, just maybe, he was still out there, fighting for the same thing she was, a place to belong. Clara closed her fist around the ring and made a decision. She wasn't going to wait anymore. She wasn't going to sit here and let the world take everything from her again. If Elias was out there fighting, she wanted to know, and if he needed help, she was going to give it, even if he'd told her not to follow, even if he'd told her to let him go. Because some promises weren't meant to be kept. The next morning, Clara packed a saddlebag, food, water, a blanket, the rifle. She saddled her horse, one of the two that had survived the fire, and stood in the yard, looking at the house one last time. It looked smaller now, lonelier, but it would still be here when she got back, if she got back. Clara swung into the saddle and turned her horse north, toward the ridge, toward the rumors of a man gathering settlers, toward whatever came next. The sun climbed higher as she rode, painting the valley in gold and green. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of rain and earth and growing things. And for the first time in weeks, Clara felt something other than grief. She felt hope. But hope was a fragile thing. By the second day, Clara's supplies were running low. By the third, her horse was limping. She stopped at a creek to let it rest, refilled her canteen, and sat in the shade, exhausted. She'd followed the rumors north, asking travelers and settlers if they'd heard anything about a man named Elias, about a coalition, about a fight. Most people looked at her like she was crazy. A few said they'd heard whispers, a movement, something building, but no one knew where. Clara sat by the creek, her head in her hands, and wondered if she'd made a mistake. Maybe Elias was gone. Maybe he'd kept running and never looked back. Maybe she was chasing a ghost. She was about to give up, to turn around and go home, when she heard it. Hooves. Clara stood quickly, her hand going to the rifle. But the rider who emerged from the trees wasn't a threat. It was a woman, young, sunburned, riding a painted mare. She stopped when she saw Clara, her eyes wary. "You lost?" the woman asked. Clara shook her head. "I'm looking for someone. Aren't we all?" "A man named Elias, tall, dark hair, walks with a limp." "You heard of him?" The woman's expression shifted. "Maybe." Clara's heart leapt. "Where?" The woman studied her for a long moment, then said, "Why are you looking for him?" "Because he's mine." The woman's eyebrows lifted. Then she smiled, small but genuine. "Follow me," she said. They rode for hours, through valleys and over ridges, past burnt homesteads and abandoned farms. Everywhere Clara looked, she saw the scars of Colfax's greed, broken fences, empty fields, places where people had once lived and been driven away. And everywhere, she saw people coming back, families rebuilding, men planting, women hauling water, and all of them moving with purpose, with something Clara recognized. Hope. Finally, the woman stopped at the top of a ridge and pointed down. There, Clara looked. Below, in a wide valley, dozens of people were gathered. Tents, wagons, horses, families, workers, fighters. And in the center of it all, standing beside a large map spread across a table, was a man Clara would have recognized anywhere. Elias. Her breath caught. He was alive, he was here, and he wasn't running anymore. Clara urged her horse forward, her heart pounding. As she rode into the camp, people turned to look. Some nodded, some smiled. And then Elias looked up from the map. His eyes met hers. For a moment he just stared, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he was moving, crossing the camp in long strides, his limp barely slowing him. Clara slid off her horse and ran to meet him. They collided in the middle of the camp, his arms wrapping around her, her face buried in his chest. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came, you idiot." He pulled back, his hands framing her face. "I told you not to. I don't care what you told me." Elias stared at her, his eyes wet. Then he kissed her, hard and desperate and full of everything they'd lost and found again. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying. "I thought I'd lost you," Clara said. "You did." Elias smiled through his tears. "But I found my way back." Clara looked around at the camp, at the people, the tents, the hope. "What is this?" she asked. "A fight," Elias said. "For everyone who lost what I lost. For everyone Colfax crushed. And you're leading it?" "I'm trying." Clara looked at him. At the man who'd stumbled into her life bleeding and broken, who'd left to save her, who'd come back stronger. "Then I'm staying," she said. Elias shook his head. "Clara, I'm staying." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." They stood together in the middle of the camp, surrounded by people who'd lost everything and were fighting to take it back. And for the first time in months, Clara felt like she was home. Until one dusk, months later, the sound of hooves returned, slow, deliberate, and heading straight for her gate. The summer had burned itself out. Autumn crept across the land like a whisper, turning the valley gold and copper, the air sharp with the smell of smoke and dry leaves. Clara had stayed with Elias through it all. Through the planning and the building, through the long days of organizing settlers and the longer nights of strategizing how to take back what had been stolen. She'd watched him transform. The man who'd once limped through her door half dead had become something else, a leader, a voice for people who'd had none. He still carried his guilt, still wore his past like a scar, but now he carried something else too, purpose. The coalition grew. Families came from all over, people who'd been burned out, threatened, driven from their land by Colfax's men. They brought their anger, their stories, their hunger for justice. Elias gave them hope. Clara gave them her hands, working beside them, cooking, mending, organizing supplies. And slowly, piece by piece, they built a case, not just with fists and fury, but with documents, witnesses, proof. They found deeds that had been forged, testimony from clerks who'd been bribed, evidence that Colfax had been systematically stealing land for years, using the courts as his weapon and violence as his backup. It took months. But when they finally had everything they needed, Elias rode to the territorial capital with a wagon full of documents and 20 settlers at his back. Clara stayed behind to manage the camp. She didn't sleep the whole week he was gone. When Elias returned, the sun was setting. Clara was hauling water from the creek when she heard the sound of hooves, multiple horses, moving at a steady pace. She dropped the buckets and ran toward the camp entrance, her heart in her throat. The riders appeared over the ridge, silhouetted against the burning sky. Elias rode at the front, his back straight, his face unreadable. Behind him, the others followed, silent and dusty from the road. Clara stopped at the edge of camp, her hands clenched. Elias dismounted slowly, handed his reins to one of the men and walked toward her. She searched his face, trying to read what had happened. "Well?" she asked. Elias stopped in front of her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled, tired, but real. "We won." Clara's knees went weak. "What?" The judge reviewed. "Everything. Every document, every witness." Colfax tried to pay him off, but there were too many eyes watching. Too many people demanding justice. Elias's voice cracked. "He ruled in our favor. Every deed Colfax stole, every claim he forged, it's all being returned." Clara stared at him. "You're serious." "Dead serious." She let out a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, then threw her arms around him. Elias caught her, held her tight, his face buried in her hair. Around them, the camp erupted. People cheered, embraced, wept. Families held each other. Men who'd lost everything stood with their heads bowed, shoulders shaking with relief. It was over. The fight was over, and they'd won. That night, they built a bonfire. The flames climbed high into the darkness, throwing light and shadow across the faces of everyone gathered. Someone brought out a fiddle, someone else produced a jug of whiskey. The music started slow, then built, a wild, joyous sound that echoed across the valley. Clara sat beside Elias on a log near the fire, watching people dance and sing. His hand rested on hers, their fingers intertwined. "What happens now?" she asked. Elias looked at her. "People go home, rebuild, start over. And you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know." Clara's chest tightened. "You're not staying?" "I don't have a place to stay. My land, the cabin I told you about, it's gone. Burned. Even with the ruling, there's nothing to go back to." Clara turned to face him. "Then come back with me." Elias blinked. "What?" "To my land. To the homestead." She squeezed his hand. "It's not much. The barn's gone. The house needs work. But it's mine. And if you want, it could be ours." Elias stared at her, something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. "Clara, I'm not asking you to marry me," she said quickly. "I'm just asking you to come home. You don't owe me anything." "I know. Then why?" "Because I don't want to be alone anymore." Her voice broke. "And because I think maybe you don't either." Elias looked at her for a long time. Then he lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. "All right," he whispered. "I'll come home." They left 2 days later. The coalition was dissolving, people scattering back to their own land, their own lives. There were tearful goodbyes, promises to visit, vows to help rebuild. Elias shook hands with every man, embraced every woman, ruffled the hair of every child, and then he and Clara mounted their horses and rode south toward the valley she'd left behind. The journey took 3 days. They rode through country that was slowly healing, fields being replanted, fences going back up, smoke rising from chimneys that had sat cold for months. Everywhere, people were returning, reclaiming. On the second night, they camped under the stars. Clara lay on her bedroll, staring up at the vast darkness, listening to the sound of Elias breathing beside her. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't opened that door?" he asked quietly. Clara thought about it. "Sometimes regret it?" "No." She turned her head to look at him. "You?" Elias met her gaze. "I regret a lot of things, but stumbling onto your land that night isn't one of them." Clara smiled. "Good." They lay in silence, the fire crackling between them, the sky full of stars. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to build. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested the ridge overlooking Clara's valley. She stopped her horse, her breath catching. The land spread before her, green and gold, the creek winding through it like a silver thread. And there, in the middle of it all, sat her house, small, weathered, still standing. "Home," she said quietly. Elias stopped beside her. "It's beautiful." Clara looked at him. "It's yours too now. If you want it." Elias's jaw worked. Then he nodded. "I want it." They rode down into the valley together. When they reached the house, Clara dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from the ride. Everything looked the same. The porch, the fence, the garden plot. Even the ruins of the barn still stood, black and skeletal against the sky. But it didn't feel the same, because this time she wasn't coming home alone. Elias swung down from his horse and stood beside her, looking at the house. "It needs work," Clara said. "Everything does. The barn, we'll rebuild it. The fence, we'll fix it." Clara looked at him. "You sure about this?" Elias turned to her, his eyes steady. "I've never been more sure of anything." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled something out, a rolled piece of paper tied with string. "What's that?" Clara asked. Elias handed it to her. "Open it." Clara untied the string and unrolled the paper. It was a deed. Her name was on it, Clara Wren, but beside it, in fresh ink, was another name, Elias Stark. Clara stared at it, her hands trembling. "What is this?" "It's yours," Elias said quietly. "I went to the land office before we left, had it transferred into both our names. Legal and binding." He paused. "If that's all right with you." Clara looked up at him, her eyes wet. "You did this? I wanted you to know I'm not leaving, not ever again." He stepped closer. "This is my home now. You're my home." Clara couldn't speak. She just folded the deed carefully and set it aside. then stepped forward and kissed him. It was different from the desperate kisses they'd shared before. This one was softer, steadier, full of promise instead of fear. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Welcome home," Clara whispered. Elias rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you." The next morning, they got to work. First, they cleared the barn ruins completely, hauling away charred wood, straightening bent nails, salvaging what little could be saved. It took 2 days. By the end, the site was clear, ready for rebuilding. Then they started on the house. The roof had leaked during the spring rains. The porch steps were rotting. The windows needed recaulking. Elias worked with the same steady patience Clara remembered, measuring and cutting and fitting each piece like it mattered. Because it did. This wasn't just repair work. This was building a life. One afternoon, as Clara stood on a ladder rechinkling the chimney, she heard hooves in the yard. She climbed down quickly, her heart jumping. But it wasn't the marshal. It wasn't Colfax's men. It was the woman from the camp, the one who'd led Clara to Elias. She sat on her painted mare, a wide smile on her sunburned face. "Heard you two made it back," the woman said. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt. "We did. Good." The woman swung down from her horse and pulled a burlap sack from her saddle. "Brought you something." She handed the sack to Clara. Inside were seeds, corn, beans, squash, wheat, enough to plant half the valley. "From the coalition?" the woman said. "Everyone chipped in. Figured you could use a fresh start." Clara's throat tightened. "You didn't have to. We wanted to." The woman smiled. "You helped us. Now we're helping you." Elias appeared from around the house, saw the woman, and grinned. "Mary, Elias." Mary tipped her hat. "Place looks good. Getting there." Mary glanced between them, something knowing in her eyes. "You two finally figure it out?" Clara blushed. Elias just smiled. "Yeah," he said. "We did." Mary laughed. "About damn time." She climbed back onto her horse. "I'll leave you to it. But if you need anything, and I mean anything, you send word. We take care of our own." She rode off, dust rising in her wake. Clara stood in the yard holding the sack of seeds, her eyes wet. Elias came up beside her. "You all right?" Clara nodded. "Yeah. I forgot what it felt like, to not be alone." Elias put his arm around her shoulders. "You're not alone. Not anymore." They stood there together, watching the sun sink lower, painting the valley in shades of gold and red. Over the next weeks, more people came. Settlers from the coalition, passing through or staying nearby. They brought tools, lumber, livestock. A few stayed to help rebuild the barn, raising walls, fitting beams, shingling the roof. It went up faster than Clara could have imagined, the frame rising strong and true under the autumn sky. By the time the first frost came, the barn was finished. Clara and Elias stood in the doorway, looking at the clean stalls, the stacked hay, the tools hanging on the walls. "It's perfect," Clara said. Elias smiled. "It's home." That night, they sat on the porch together, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars appear. "What do you think happens next?" Clara asked. "We plant in the spring, raise some animals, fix the fence again." Elias looked at her. "Live?" Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Sounds good. Yeah?" "Yeah." They sat in comfortable silence, the valley dark and quiet around them. And then, Elias reached into his pocket and pulled something out. Clara looked down. It was a ring. Not her wedding ring. That was still in the drawer where she'd left it. This was different, simple. A band of hammered silver, worn smooth with age. "It was my mother's," Elias said quietly. "The only thing I kept when I lost everything else." Clara stared at it, her heart pounding. "I know I'm not much," Elias continued. "I know I've got a past that won't stay buried, but I want a future, with you. If you'll have me—" Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Elias nodded. "Yeah, I am." Clara didn't hesitate. "Yes." Elias exhaled, something breaking loose in his chest. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and kissed her. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying. "I love you," Elias whispered. "I love you too." They sat there on the porch, holding each other, the ring gleaming in the starlight. And the house that had been so silent for so long, felt full again, not with noise, but with life. The wedding was small. Just a handful of people from the coalition, a traveling preacher who happened through, and the two of them standing in the yard under the cottonwood tree. Clara wore a simple dress. Elias wore a clean shirt and his best boots. The vows were brief, spoken quietly under the wide blue sky. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Elias kissed her like it was the first and last time, and everyone cheered. They celebrated with a meal: roasted chicken, fresh bread, apple pie made from the orchard they'd pruned together. People laughed and danced and toasted the couple late into the evening, and when the last guest finally left and the fire burned low, Clara and Elias stood alone in the yard, hand in hand. "Mrs. Stark," Elias said, testing the name. Clara smiled. "Mr. Stark." He pulled her close, rested his chin on top of her head. "Thank you." "For what?" "For opening the door that night." Clara wrapped her arms around him. "Thank you for stumbling through it." They stood there in the darkness, the valley silent around them, the house glowing soft and warm behind them. And for the first time in years, Clara felt complete, not because she'd found someone to fill the emptiness, but because she'd found someone to build something new with, something stronger than what had been lost, something worth fighting for. That night, as they lay in bed, together now, in the same room, the same space, Elias traced the line of Clara's jaw with his finger. "I never thought I'd get this," he said quietly. "What?" "Peace." Clara turned to face him. "You deserve it." "I'm not sure about that." "I am." Elias looked at her, his eyes soft in the darkness. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this." Clara smiled. "I already don't." She kissed him, slow and tender, and they held each other as the night deepened around them. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The stars wheeled overhead, and the house that had witnessed so much grief, so much loss, held them both in its quiet embrace. A home, at last, for both of them. And when the night fell soft over the valley, the light from her window burned brighter than it had in years. Spring came gentle, not with a roar or a rush, but slowly, like someone remembering how to breathe. The frost melted from the ground. The creek swelled with snowmelt, clear and cold, and one morning Clara woke to find the first green shoots pushing through the dark soil of the garden plot. She stood in the yard, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and stared at them. Behind her, the door opened. Elias stepped out, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He came up beside her and followed her gaze. "They're coming up," he said quietly. Clara nodded, unable to speak. They'd planted together in the fall: corn, beans, squash, wheat. All the seeds Mary had brought, plus more they'd traded for. It had taken weeks of hard work, breaking ground, planting rows, building irrigation channels. And through the long winter, Clara had wondered if any of it would survive. But here they were, growing. Elias handed her a cup. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and sipped the hot, bitter liquid. "It's going to be a good year," Elias said. Clara looked at him, at the man who'd stumbled through her door broken and bleeding, who'd left to save her, who'd come back with a ring and a deed and a promise. "Yeah," she said. "It is." The days stretched longer. The sun rose earlier, set later, warming the valley until the grass grew tall and the trees burst into bloom. The orchard, the one they'd pruned together, came alive with white blossoms that filled the air with sweetness. Clara walked through it one afternoon, her fingers trailing over the rough bark, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: joy. Not the desperate, clinging kind, not the fragile hope that could shatter at any moment, but something steady, something real. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Elias approached, his hat tilted back, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked tired. They'd been working since dawn, but content. "What are you smiling about?" he asked. Clara hadn't realized she was. "Just this." She gestured at the orchard, the blossoms, the valley beyond. Elias came up beside her and took her hand. "Yeah, me too." They stood there in the dappled shade, breathing in the smell of apple blossoms and new growth, and for a moment, the world felt impossibly right. By early summer, the first crops were coming in. Not much, just enough to know the land was giving back what they'd put into it. Clara and Elias worked side by side, harvesting beans and lettuce, pulling carrots from the soft earth, cutting the first stalks of wheat. It was hard work, back-breaking, sun-scorched work, but it was theirs. One evening, as they sat on the porch shelling peas, a wagon appeared on the road. Clara shaded her eyes, squinting. "You expecting anyone?" Elias shook his head. "No." The wagon drew closer. Two people sat in the front, a man and a woman, both young, their faces hopeful and nervous. In the back, Clara could see furniture, tools, supplies, settlers. The wagon stopped at the gate. The man climbed down, removed his hat. "Evening, folks. Name's Thomas Brennan. This is my wife, Sarah. We heard there was land available in this valley." Clara glanced at Elias. He stood, walked to the edge of the porch. "There is," Elias said, "about 5 miles north. Good soil, water access. It's part of the reclamation, land that was seized by Colfax and returned to the territory. You file a claim at the land office in Bitter Creek." Thomas nodded eagerly. "We heard about what you did, what you all did, fighting back, getting justice." He looked at Elias with something close to reverence. "You're Elias Stark, aren't you?" Elias shifted uncomfortably. "I am. We heard about you, about how you stood up when no one else would." "I wasn't alone," Thomas smiled. "Still, what you did, it gave people like us hope. That maybe we could have a place, build something." Clara saw something flicker across Elias's face. Pride, maybe, or just quiet satisfaction. "You'll do fine here," Elias said. "Land's good, people are good. You work hard, you'll make it. Thank you, sir." Thomas climbed back onto the wagon. "Maybe we'll be neighbors." "Maybe so." The wagon rolled on, disappearing down the road. Clara walked over and slipped her arm around Elias's waist. "You did that. We did that." "No." She looked up at him. "You started it. You gave them something to believe in." Elias looked uncomfortable. "I just did what needed doing. That's what makes it matter." He kissed the top of her head, said nothing, and they went back to shelling peas. But over the next weeks, more wagons came. Families, mostly. Young couples, old farmers, people looking for a fresh start. They all stopped to ask directions, to introduce themselves, to thank Elias for what he'd done. And slowly, the valley began to fill. New homesteads appeared on the horizon. Smoke rose from new chimneys. At night, Clara could see lantern light flickering in distant windows, signs of life where there had been emptiness. The land was waking up. By midsummer, the valley felt transformed. Fields of wheat and corn stretched in every direction, golden and green. Cattle grazed in pastures. Children's laughter echoed across the creek. On Sundays, families gathered at the crossroads for impromptu meetings, sharing news, trading goods, helping one another with repairs. Clara and Elias were at the center of it, not because they sought it, but because people came to them, for advice, for help, for the quiet reassurance that someone had been through the worst and survived. One afternoon, a young woman named Anne arrived with her 2 children, both girls under 10. Her husband had died in the winter, and she was trying to manage the farm alone. "I don't know if I can do it," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Clara took her hands. "You are." "How do you know?" "Because I've been where you are, and I made it. So will you." Anne looked at her with desperate hope. "Will you teach me?" Clara glanced at Elias. He nodded. "Yes," Clara said, "I will." Over the next weeks, Anne became a regular visitor. Clara taught her how to manage the animals, how to plant and harvest, how to fix what broke and build what was needed. The girls played in the yard, their laughter filling the spaces that had once been silent, and Clara realized something. This was what mercy looked like, not just pulling someone from a storm, but walking beside them through everything that came after. In late summer, the town of Bitter Creek held a harvest festival. It was the first in years, a celebration of the land's recovery, of the people who'd returned, of the justice that had finally been served. Tables were set up in the town square. Families brought food. A band played on a makeshift stage. Clara and Elias arrived in the afternoon, their wagon loaded with vegetables and preserves to trade. The moment they stepped into the square, people turned. Some waved. Some called out greetings. A few approached to shake Elias's hand, to thank him, to tell him how much things had changed. Clara watched him handle it with quiet grace. Humble, uncomfortable, but kind. And she felt a swell of pride so strong it took her breath away. This was her husband, the man who'd been called a criminal, a fugitive, a danger. Now he was a hero, not because of what he'd done in anger or desperation, but because of what he'd done with purpose, with courage, with love. That evening, As the sun set and lanterns were lit around the square, the mayor, a stocky man named Garrett, stood on the stage and called for quiet. "I want to say a few words," Garrett began. "This valley has been through hell. We lost homes, we lost family, we lost hope." He paused. "But we didn't lose everything, because one man stood up when the rest of us didn't know how. One man gathered us together and reminded us that justice isn't just for the powerful, it's for all of us." He looked directly at Elias. "Elias Stark, would you come up here?" Elias froze. Clara squeezed his hand. "Go," she whispered. Reluctantly, Elias made his way through the crowd. People clapped as he climbed onto the stage. Garrett shook his hand, then turned to the crowd. "This man risked everything to fight for what was right. And because of him, we're standing here tonight, free, on our own land." The crowd erupted in applause. Garrett held up a hand. "So on behalf of everyone in this valley, I want to present you with this." He handed Elias a wooden box. Elias opened it slowly. Inside was a medal, simple, engraved with the words, "For courage and justice." Elias stared at it, his throat working. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I didn't do this alone. Every person here fought, every person here sacrificed. This belongs to all of us." The applause grew louder. Elias stepped down, and Clara met him at the edge of the stage. He was shaking. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded, unable to speak. She took his hand, and they walked back into the crowd together. Autumn came again. The air turned crisp. The leaves blazed orange and red. Clara and Elias worked long days bringing in the harvest. Corn, wheat, beans, squash. More than they'd ever imagined. More than enough. One evening, as they stood in the full barn, looking at the stores of grain and preserved food, Elias shook his head in disbelief. "We did it," he said. Clara smiled. "We did. I mean, really did it. We made it through." "Yeah." She leaned against him. "We did." Elias wrapped his arm around her. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong. It won't." "How do you know?" "Because we already survived the worst." Clara looked up at him. "Everything else is just living." Elias kissed her forehead. "I love you. I love you too." Winter came mild. Snow fell, but not heavily. The cold settled in, but it wasn't cruel. Clara and Elias spent long evenings by the fire, reading, talking, planning for the spring. Sometimes neighbors stopped by. Anne and her girls, Thomas and Sarah, others from the valley. They'd share a meal, swap stories, sit together in the warmth and talk about the future. And slowly, Clara realized something. Her house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home, not because of the walls or the roof or the land, but because of the people who filled it, the life that lived inside it. One night, as snow fell softly outside, Clara sat by the fire mending a shirt. Elias sat across from her, carving a piece of wood, a toy horse for Anne's youngest daughter. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked. Clara looked up. "That night, when I found you in the storm. What about it?" "I almost didn't open the door." Elias's hands stilled. "Why not?" "Because I was afraid. Of me. Of everything." Clara set down the mending. "I'd been alone so long I'd forgotten what it was like to let someone in, and I thought, if I opened that door, everything would change." "It did, yeah." Clara smiled. "But not the way I thought. I thought it would break me. Instead, it saved me." Elias looked at her, his eyes soft. "You saved me too. We saved each other." He stood, crossed the room, and pulled her into his arms. They stood there by the fire, holding each other, the snow falling silently outside. And Clara thought about mercy, about the way one small choice, one act of compassion in a storm, could change everything, not just for one person, but for an entire valley. Spring came again, the third spring since the storm, the second since their wedding. Clara stood in the garden, her hands in the soil, planting seeds. Behind her, the orchard was blooming again, white petals drifting on the breeze like snow. She heard footsteps and looked up. Elias walked toward her, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "What's that?" she asked. He knelt beside her and unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden sign, carved and sanded smooth. Words were burned into the surface. "Stark Homestead, built on mercy." Clara's throat tightened. "You made this?" "Yeah." Elias looked at her. I thought we should put it by the gate, so people know what? That this place stands for something, that it started with kindness, and that it'll keep standing because of it. Clara traced the words with her finger, her eyes wet. It's perfect, she whispered. Together, they walked to the gate and mounted the sign. It hung there, solid and true, facing the road, and as they stood back to admire it, a wagon appeared in the distance. More settlers, more people looking for a home. Clara smiled. Here we go again. Elias took her hand. Yeah, here we go. The years passed. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. The valley grew. More families came. A schoolhouse was built. A church. A general store. The town of Bitter Creek expanded, thriving on the trade and community that had returned. Clara and Elias's homestead became a landmark, a place where people knew they could find help, advice, or just a kind word. Children played in their yard, neighbors stopped by for coffee, and every spring, the orchard bloomed, filling the valley with the smell of hope. Clara never forgot the night she opened the door, never forgot the fear, the choice, the uncertainty, but she also never forgot what came after. The barn they built, the fence they mended, the love they found, and the life they made. Not in spite of the storm, but because of it. One evening, many years later, Clara and Elias sat on the porch together. They were older now, gray-haired, weathered by sun and work, but still strong, still steady. The valley spread before them, dotted with lights from distant homesteads. The sky was clear, full of stars. You ever regret it? Elias asked. Regret what? Opening that door. Clara looked at him, at the man she'd saved and who'd saved her in return. Not even once, she said. Elias smiled. Good. He took her hand and they sat in comfortable silence. Behind them, the house glowed warm with lamplight. Before them, the valley stretched wide and peaceful, and above them, the stars wheeled slowly, ancient and constant. The land remembered. It remembered the storm and the fire, the fear and the fighting, the loss and the grief. But more than that, it remembered the mercy, the single act of compassion that had changed everything. And long after Clara and Elias's footsteps faded, long after their names became stories passed from one generation to the next, the land kept blooming. The orchard kept bearing fruit. The valley kept welcoming those who needed a home, because kindness, once planted, grows roots deeper than any storm can shake. And love, once built, stands longer than any fire can burn. The house on the prairie remained, a testament not to wealth or power, but to the simple, enduring truth that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open a door, even when you're afraid, even when you don't know what comes next, because mercy has a way of coming back, and home has a way of finding those who build it with their own hands and offer it with an open heart. The wind moved through the grass, the sun set golden over the valley, and the land that had witnessed so much, held it all gently, remembering, always remembering, that kindness is never wasted, that love is never lost, and that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the smallest acts of grace. A door opening in a storm, a hand reaching into darkness, a heart choosing mercy over fear, and from that single moment, that single choice, everything else follows. A life rebuilt, a love discovered, a legacy that blooms forever. And long after their footsteps faded, the land kept blooming, as if kindness itself had taken root,